A German battleship scuttled itself in water, so shallow you can see parts o' fight from the shore. No submersibles nor bots. Number 3 mile, dive down into total darkness. Just a rusted hull sitting in plain sight, outside a city of over 1 million people. For more than 80 years, most people know the Graf Spee was scuttled. Some people even know early where. What almost nobo dick knows is why. With the wreck sitting in water this shallow, this reachable, this visible, nobody has ever actually finished bringing it up. The answer turned out to be a lot messier than I expected, tangled up in mud, money, and a legal fight that lasted decades. And oh, part of it I genuinely had to check twice before I believed it. History, the Admiral Graf Spee was one of Germany's so-called pocket battleships, a class specifically designed to get around the tonnage limits set by the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. On paper, it was a cruiser. In practice, it carried 611-inch guns, heavier armor than any actual cruiser afloat, and a top speed fast enough to outrun almost anything that could outgun it. It was built for one job: commerce raiding. Slip into open shipping lanes, hunt merchant vessels scaring supplies for Britain, sink them, and vanish before a proper warship could respond. In the autumn of 1939, in the opening months off the Second World War, that ice exactly what it did. Over roughly 3 months, the Graf Spee sank 9 British and Allied merchant ships across the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, and here is the detail that made the ship's captain unusual. Not one sailor from any of those captured ships died. Hans Langsdorff, the Graf Spee's commander, took prisoners aboard his own ship rather than leaving crews adrift at sea, and later transferred them to a supply vessel rather than risk their lives in combat. Even among his enemies, Langsdorff developed a reputation as an unusually correct and human commander. That reputation is going to matter later in this story, more than you'd expect. The battle, by December 1939. 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMNZ's Achilles, had spent weeks shunting the Graf Spee across the South Atlantic. On December 13th, they found it off the coast of Uruguay, near Thameth of the River Plate estuary. What followed became known as the Battle off River Plate. On paper, this shouldn't have been close. The Graf individually outgunned all 3 cruisers combined, and in the opening newts it showed. Exeter took catastrophic damage almost immediately, turrets knocked out one by one. Fire spreading across the deck, dozens off her crew killed or wounded. But the 2 smaller, faster cruisers split off and attacked from different angles, forcing the Graf Spee to divide its fire between 3 separate targets instead of concentrating on one. In the exchange, the German ship took damage of its own. Shells tore into her fuel processing system and her galley. Langsdorff believed. In the heat of the that his oil purification equipment was critically damaged, leaving him without enough usable fuel to make the long return voyage to Germany. Later analysis suggests the damage was serious, but likely less severe than he judged it to be at that time. Believing his ship was crippled, Langsdorff broke off the engagement and made for the nearest neutral port, Montevideo, Uruguay, the Scuttling. This is where international law started dictating the outcome instead of naval gunfire. Under the rules governing neutral ports, a belligerent warship was allowed exactly 72 hours in harbor before it had to either leave orb and turn there for the remainder of the war. Langsdorff requested more to make repairs. He was refused. Then British intelligence ran one of the most effective bluffs of the entire war. They fed deliberately misleading reps, suggesting a much larger British fleet, including an aircraft carrier, was already waiting just outside the harbor, ready to finish the Graf Spee the moment it left port. None of it was true. The actual reinforcements were still days away, but Langsdorff believed it. Faced with a hard 72-hour deadline, a ship he believed was too damaged to fight Urutron anything. In a crew of over 1,000 men whose lives he considered his responsibility, he made his decision. He would not risk his crew in a battle believed was already lost. And he would not hand an intact German warship over to the enemy either. On December 17, 1939, the Graf Spee sailed just beyond the harbor limits. in full view of tens of thousands of people who had gathered along the Montevideo shoreline, specifically to watch what would happen next. His crew had already been quietly evacuated onto a waiting merchant ship. Then, with no one left aboard, Langsdorff detonated scuttling charges. The explosions tore through the hull below Thorderline. In front of a crowd that had come out just to witness it, the Graf Spee settled into the mud of the River Plate estuary. 3 days later, alone in a hotel room in Buenos Aires, Langsdorff shot himself. He left a note explaining that he could not survive the loss of his ship, and his body was found wrapped not in the NASA flag, but in the naval ensign of Imperial Germany. Why has nobody fully salvaged it? Here's the part that genuinely surprised me. Unlike almost every other wreck this channel has covered, the Graf Spee is not hard to reach. It rests in only about 36 feet of water, shallow enough that for decades, sections of its superstructure beneath surface at low tide. A diver can reach the hull in minutes, not hours, with no specialized deep-sea equipment trekkward at all. So why Marathon, 80 years later, is most of the ship still sitting down there? The first answer is ownership, and for decades that question genuinely did not have a clear answer. Germany never formally designated the site a war grave, since the crew survived and the ship itself was empty when it went down. Uruguay, for its part, treated wreck first as a navigational izard, and only later as a piece of its own national maritime history worth protecting and studying. A private salvage company was eventually granted recovery rights, and starting in 1997, began bringing pieces up in stages. A 500-pound bronze eagle figure, head from the stern, a rangefinder, sections of armor plating, shell casings, and personal effects belonging to the crew. Some of that material now sits in a naval museum in Montevideo, on public display, but recovering pieces is not the same as recovering the ship. The hull itself is enormous, partially collapsed after decades underwater, and buried under accumulated river-bottom silt that has built up for generations. Raising a structure that size out of soft, shifting mud is a fundamentally different engineering problem, than raising something resting on rock or sand, and it is far more expensive. Here's the part that took me by surprise. The economics of it have simply never worked. Scrap value, museum value, tourism revenue combined have never come close to covering the cost of a genuine full-hull recovery operation. Every serious proposal put forward over decades has stalled once the actual budget numbers came in. On top of that, the original salvage companion to the Uruguayan government have clashed repeatedly over permits, profit-sharing arrangements, and the harder question of what counts as protected national heritage versus what can legally be sold to private collectors. Multiple legal disputes shave frozen recovery work entirely for years at a stretch. So the wreck sits in a strange middle ground that this channel hasn't really covered before. Not a protected war grave, like the Bismarck. Not sealed away by extreme diff, like the wrecks at Bikini Atoll. Just tangled in silt, cost, and paperwork, recoverable in theory, unrecovered in practice. Conclusion. So that is where the Admiral Graf Spee actually is. Not 3 miles down, not locked behind international law as a gravesite. Sitting in shallow water, a short boat ride from a city of 1.5 million people, buying gray covered one piece at a time, when of Earth money and the permits happened tow line. The ship that raided merchant convoys for 3 months without a single captured sailor. Dying was ultimately brought down not by British guns, but by a bluff and finished offby, its own captain's hand, rather than the enemy's. Langsdorff scuttled his ship to deny Britain a trophy. 8 years later, it is still being taken apart piece by piece, in full view off the very shore he watched it sink from. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments, and I will make more of these for more ships.